When you go home, tell them of us and say that for your tomorrow, we gave our today.
During the First World War, over 1 million Indian soldiers voluntarily joined the British Army to fight for the Allied powers. Thousands got wounded and were brought to England for treatment. Some recovered from their injuries, but many never returned home. Over 7,000 wounded soldiers were brought to the New Forest area for treatment.
The sacrifice made in the First World War was huge. Over 70,000 casualties, thousands of Indians wounded and actually brought to the UK to be treated. And most people know about the Brighton Pavilion, which was converted to look after soldiers, including Indian soldiers. But very few know about Bournemouth, where the soldiers were looked after as well, and the friendship and kindness shown by the local population to the Indian soldiers. And can you imagine the Indian soldiers coming from India to Europe for the first time ever in their lives and having to fight in the trenches in those awful conditions? It must have been awful and alien for them. And any friendship and warmth would have been so welcoming. And that is what the British people showed them.
The Indian Army provided 2 divisions of infantry, the Lahore Division and the Meerut Division, and they went out to France and Flanders, arriving in October 1914. They were soon in the front line. In fact, they got into the front line by the 20th of October 1914 and were in action by the end of the month. The British Army had not really expected the huge number of casualties, both British and Indian. The Indians were making a major contribution to the British war effort at that time. And certainly we know by November 1914, 1/3 of the British front line was held by the Indian Army. We've got the Meerut Indian General Hospital, based in 2 hotels, from November 1914 through to April 1915. The Lady Hardinge Hospital, 500 beds, opens on the 15th of January 1915, closes in March 1916. We've got the number 8A hospital in Bournemouth, in the Mont d'Or Hotel. That remains until late 1915, and 2 convalescent depots at Milford and Barton-on-Sea. A sizable Indian medical presence in our area.
It wasn't for those million-strong soldiers who came at the time when the European or the British suffered very heavy casualty in the early part of the battle, and to fill up that gap, the Indian soldier came. They distinguished themselves with valor and bravery, won many military crosses, Victoria crosses, and Distinguished Service Medal. So we are a matter of pride that I stand on this land in United Kingdom, where my ancestors contributed a great deal and preserved the king and empire and the world freedom.
One of the big things with the Indian hospitals, we were lucky because although there's a lot of documentary evidence, there would have been very little photographic evidence had it not been for one man, and his name was John Martin. He was a local chemist, but he was also a very good photographer, and probably, as far as Brockenhurst goes, I would say 80–85% of all Indian photographs were taken by him. But the one thing that interests me, they do show that he was a very good photographer, but he also included a lot of villagers in the various groups that he took. Some of his own children, and some of the, I think he probably just pulled them off the streets and put them in the groups. And we do have quite a large number of illustrations showing villagers with the actual groups of Indians. There is also one I've got which shows him with a group of Indians with his two children at the back of his shop, and he's actually got a turban on.
His name was Sukha. We don't even have a second name for him. He's entered as Sukha Kallu, which means nothing. He was probably dark-skinned and they called him dark, you know. He came as a cleaner. Now he belonged to the, you know, what was then the untouchable class. So he was lower caste. He was a cleaner. He came here, he was cleaning the ships, he was in the trenches, he was cleaning the trenches. And then he fell ill and he came to the hospitals in Brockenhurst in New Forest. And Sukha then fell ill. And this is just the first winter of the war. Sukha got pneumonia and he fell ill. And then he died. He was in the hospital that he had cleaned. He became a patient in the same hospital. And then he died in January 1915. And then his story starts in a different way, because the hospital records say that Sukha was first sent to the Hindus to cremate, where they used to cremate them near Brighton. And the Hindus said, he's untouchable, so we are not going to cremate him. And then he was sent to the Muslims. And the Muslim, the mullah, you know, he said that, no, Sukha is not a Muslim, we are not going to bury him. So suddenly Sukha he's stuck in no man's land. You know, not of his creating. This war was not of his creating. He's been rejected by his own countrymen. And to me, that was really moving, because, you know, these caste differences existed at this time, and they still do. But, you know, the fact that he had come all the way here to die in these hospitals, clean them, dye them, and then nobody wanted to, you know, do his final rites. But there's a happy ending. So the local vicar of the church in Brockenhurst, it was St. Nicholas Church, he said that Sukha died for us. He died for our war, and we will bury Sukha. And so Sukha is buried in this beautiful church in the New Forest. And I think it's actually a perfect place for him. You know, he's at peace, he's in a beautiful space. His life must have been, because of all the caste, you know, distinctions against him, he was always looked down upon, I'm sure. So for him, this was beautiful. And he has the largest headstone in that area. And this headstone was actually paid for by all the local villagers and the nurses. And his funeral was attended by the vicar, by the local parish.
The Friends of the Indian Soldiers in the New Forest is a group that is dedicated to preserving the Indian Memorial Obelisk in Barton-on-Sea. It also seeks to research and promote the history of the Indian Army hospitals in Barton-on-Sea and the wider New Forest and Bournemouth area.
I realised that there was a lot of history that a lot of people in Barton-on-Sea had absolutely no idea about. So the idea of the group is to start trying to focus ourselves on that history, learn a little bit more about it, understand what happened here over 100 years ago now, and how our local community was involved in really, I hope, throwing their arms around the Indian soldiers who came here, just to make them feel more welcome. And there's so much more to it than just the story of the soldiers, really about, you know, how they lived while they were here, what happened to them when they went home. So I think we're here really, the group is here to find out a lot more about that history, to make it relevant to today, and to share it, not only with our own local population, but with schools particularly, with young children, and with our colleagues in the Indian communities, both here in Bournemouth and over in Southampton, and in a wider way as well.
Every year, on the 10th of July, New Milton Town Council organises a commemoration service at Indian Memorial Obelisk in Barton-on-Sea. Local residents gather in numbers to pay their respects to the Indian soldiers who lost their lives in the First World War.
"100 years ago, the world was a different place. The Indian Army was composed of men from countries which are now modern-day India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and of course the Gurkhas from Nepal. Historical records tell us that the inhabitants of New Milton and Barton made the Indian soldiers very welcome during their stay here. Photographs show the Indian soldiers mixing with British soldiers and local residents.
They were still in their cotton khaki uniforms, facing a harsh European winter. Moreover, there was a severe shortage of arms and ammunition. The Indians had never fought under these circumstances. They were up against one of the mightiest armies in the world without proper equipment, yet they carried on. The British side were exhausted, and it was the Indian soldiers who held the line. If they had not been there, the Germans would have reached the sea. 11 Victoria Crosses, many other honors. There were tales of how they saved their colleagues and their officers. There were tales of those who took a bullet while saving another, tales of their loyalty, tales of how they kept up their spirits. And as we stand here today on the seafront, we can only hope when they walked here, they would have been greeted by the local people who would have thanked them for coming here and fighting their war. I believe, as I was talking before the ceremony, that they were called our guests, and they were treated very well, which is very heartwarming. And they would also be happy to know that over 100 years later, we would gather in this spot and remember them. Today, there are descendants of soldiers living in Britain who can be proud of what their ancestors achieved. So let us tell those stories and keep their memories alive.
This particular symbol is very dear to our hearts in New Milton because these gentlemen, the soldiers of India and all the other countries of the motherland, fought against a terrible enemy in the First World War. And loads of them never came back to their countries. Loads of them gave their life for me, for my mum and dad, for my gran and granddad, and the people of New Milton. We really loved to have them when they came over. They were welcomed with open arms, and we tried to make their stay as best as possible. But this is why it's so dear to us in New Milton, because they gave their lives for our life.
If we take a step back and look at the climate that we're living in, over 100 years ago, this area, which is 100% white British, opened their doors and welcomed foreign visitors who they've never even seen before. The nearest person they would have seen to a foreigner was a Frenchman, and yet they opened their doors to these foreigners coming across the other side of the world. And that just shows what a diverse and multicultural country we are, and how we all share the same heritage and beliefs and values. And this remembrance not only connects India and the UK closer together, it just shows the huge importance that India played for the freedom of this country and for the freedom of the Commonwealth.
As a town councillor, I was pleased when English Heritage upgraded this particular monument to Class 2. That upgrading, which happened in the year 2017-16, about that time, it brought to the attention the residents of the town how important this monument is. And I have followed it through, and as long as I've got air in my lungs, I will ensure that this event proceeds. We couple this with an afternoon ceremony on Remembrance Sunday when we assemble here at 3 o'clock to remember those friends from India that gave their lives in the First World War. It is another thing of mine is that I must ensure that the youth of New Milton carry the baton forward. To that degree, I liaise frequently with the schools and invite the schools, as you've seen today, to come along and be part of these commemorations. These young people are the youth of today, but the leaders of tomorrow. And may God help us to retain this stone, or this monument, this monument for the future for many, many more years to come.
It is also reported that Mahatma Gandhi and his wife Kasturba Gandhi was also present in England when the First World War broke out. In 1914 to 15, Kasturba Gandhi worked in India Army hospitals on England's south coast.
The Indian soldiers, to show their gratitude, would give to my grandmother some of their water containers. Here's one, this brass one, which was standard War Department issue for the period for the troops that were staying in the cliff in the Hotel Victoria, which had been commandeered. This one here, this one is more personal because it actually has the owner's name on it. These have been treasured possessions in my family ever since. There was, however, one other possession which was handed over, and that was from a Sikh who was so obviously impressed with the caring nature of my grandmother that he presented his turban to her. Where I am standing in the position that my late grandfather stood when he was postman in this village. And around him in the picture you will see some of the Indian soldiers that were in the village during this period of 1915-1916. Here you have one of the village children actually dressed up as a wounded Indian soldier. And I think there's no more better an example of how that shows the friendship between our two nations. Because obviously you can see that everyone is enjoying the fact, A, that the photographer's here to record the event, and the boy in particular, I'm very serious because after all, this is, the troops have been through this, and this is my way of replicating how they've been.
In the First World War, large numbers of Indians did volunteer for the British Indian Army. Mahatma Gandhi himself had actually run recruitment drives. It is told there are two kind of extremes that you see. One is where it is believed, and it has been reported, historians have recorded, that many Indians were Indian soldiers or soldiers from the Indian subcontinent were stationed at extremely risky locations right on the front line. The casualties were therefore a lot higher. Many of them also died because of lack of adequate clothing and equipment for what was very cold climates for the Indian body in Europe. Having said that, there's also another side, no doubt, that when Indian soldiers came to the UK for rest and recuperation, the common people, it has been reported, treated Indians well. Common people had a sense of perhaps empathy towards the Indian soldiers, and that of course must be acknowledged.
I think it's important to show the respects. If you look at the numbers of men that served from other countries and the foreign allies to Britain during the time, if it wasn't for for the Indians and the Africans and the Nepalese, all these units that fought together with us alongside in Burma, we wouldn't have not had enough manpower to sufficiently sustain ourselves.
And because of that war, a lot of soldiers came and they changed the perception of the British people. And all this, they felt that these people, these Indian people are friendly. They have come here to save us. And from there onward, a lot of Indian soldiers left behind, they stayed behind. And our relationship started from the First World War.
Let us remember that there is a corner of a British field that is forever India. And it is our shared history that makes our shared future.
The Indian sacrifice that helped Britain win that war, without the contribution of the Indians, without their sacrifice, Britain would not have won the First World War. That is a fact. And so we owe our freedom to the service and the sacrifice of those brave Indians who fought. 11 Indians were awarded the Victoria Cross in the First World War. So I'm grateful, and I think we must make sure that people in the UK know and learn about the contribution made by the Indians in the First World War.